For 12 years, the board of Harlan Motors hid a prototype engine beneath the north basement, calling it a deadly failure. No one was allowed to touch it, no one was allowed to ask, and every engineer who mentioned it quietly vanished from the company. But on the final inspection before the factory was sold off for almost nothing, a quiet single father named Mason quietly noticed an old weld mark and understood the whole truth in an instant. The moment he turned the first wrench, the entire boardroom began to tremble, because a secret long buried was finally waking. Detroit woke that winter morning under a gray sky that seemed to press down on the rooftops of Harlan Motors like a lid closing over something already half dead. The factory had once been the pride of American engine manufacturing, its name stamped on machines that powered freight lines across the entire country, but those days had thinned into rumor. Half the assembly floor sat dark, the workforce had been cut 3 times in 5 years, and the production line that remained crawled along at a pace that felt less like manufacturing and more like waiting. The board of directors had already decided the ending. A foreign conglomerate had offered a price low enough to insult the building's history, and the paperwork sat ready, needing only a final signature to erase 100 years of labor. Evelyn Harlan had inherited the chief executive's chair only months earlier, and she had spent every one of those months trying to slow a sale that the board treated as inevitable. She was the founder's daughter, sharp enough to read a balance sheet faster than the men twice her age, but the board dismissed her instincts as sentiment rather than judgment. They called her too young behind closed doors and too emotional in open ones, and every objection she raised was answered with a polite, condescending nod before the conversation moved on without her. Mason Carter moved through the plant in a different rhythm entirely, invisible to the people who mattered and essential to the ones who actually kept the place running. He worked the night shift, wore a jacket stained dark with years of grease, and rarely spoke unless someone asked him a direct question. He stayed out of the politics that consumed the upper floors, choosing instead to quietly repair what the daytime engineering staff had given up on, fixing problems nobody above him had even noticed yet. The workers respected him the way people respect someone who simply makes things work, without ceremony and without complaint. Cameron Blake, the chief financial officer, treated Mason the way he treated most of the floor staff, as scenery rather than people. He mocked him once in front of a junior crew, saying a man who spent his nights fixing wrenches could not possibly understand strategy worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Mason said nothing back. He simply finished tightening the bolt in his hand and walked to the next station, because arguing with men like Cameron had never once changed anything in his experience, and he had learned long ago which battles were worth the cost. Evelyn happened to be touring the floor when she saw Mason solve, in under 10 minutes, a stamping press failure that her own engineering team had failed to fix in 3 full days. She did not say anything to him directly, but she watched the way he worked, calm and exact, and she found herself wondering why a man with that kind of instinct was content standing at the bottom of a building that barely noticed him. It was a small moment, easy to overlook, yet it lodged itself in her mind and refused to leave. Near the end of that long gray shift, Joseph Grant, the plant's honest and weathered floor manager, pulled Mason aside with a warning rather than small talk. He told him that the north basement was being sealed permanently before the sale went through, locked away from inspection along with whatever was still stored down there. Mason went still the moment he heard the words north basement, because that single phrase belonged to a part of his life he had spent 12 years trying not to remember, a buried project that had once cost him everything he had built. He did not ask Joseph any questions about it. He simply nodded, the way he nodded at most things, and finished locking up his tool cart for the night, though something in his chest had already started to tighten in a way he had not felt in years. Outside the loading dock, the city had gone fully dark, snow drifting sideways under the security lights, and Mason walked to his truck the same way he always did, alone, unhurried, carrying a weight that nobody around him could see. Evelyn called for a final asset inventory before the sale documents could be signed. A routine walkthrough meant to confirm what the company still owned. Jackson Vale, the chairman of the board, tried to wave the request aside, insisting the north basement held nothing but broken equipment with no commercial value worth the trouble of inspecting. Evelyn found that strange, because the same worthless space had always required board-level clearance to enter, a level of security that seemed excessive for a room full of scrap metal. She said nothing in the meeting, but the contradiction settled into her like a splinter she could not stop touching. Amelia Brooks, an investigative attorney Evelyn had quietly hired outside the company's usual legal network of advisors, had already begun pulling old asset records, and she found something unsettling almost immediately. A cluster of files connected to the basement had been deleted from the system on the exact same date 12 years earlier, with no explanation attached to the deletion log. When the electronic lock on the old steel door failed to respond, Mason was called down to force it open manually, since he was one of the few people left who still understood the building's original mechanical systems. The moment the door gave way, the group stepped into a space heavy with dust and silence, a tarp draped over something massive chained down in the center of the room like an animal nobody trusted to wake. It was the Meridian engine, once rumored inside the company to be capable of reshaping heavy transport entirely, a prototype so promising that people still spoke its name in careful, lowered voices. Jackson demanded the area be closed immediately, insisting the engine had detonated during testing years earlier and had nearly destroyed the company's reputation along with it. Mason stood in front of the machine for a long time, studying the welds, the hand-stamped serial markings, and one small detail in the housing that only someone who had worked the original project would recognize. When Cameron ordered him to leave the basement at once, Mason answered with a quiet certainty that stopped the room cold, telling them the engine had not failed because of its design. Nobody moved. Jackson asked sharply, what gave him any authority to make a claim like that? Mason did not answer the question directly. Instead, he pointed to a cluster of valves installed backward, and said that if this engine had truly exploded the way they claimed, someone had made sure it would. Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest, a slow and uncomfortable recognition that the board had buried far more than a single failed experiment 12 years earlier. Jackson's expression hardened into something closer to fear than anger, though he tried to mask it with authority. Before the basement door was sealed again that evening, Jackson warned Mason directly that touching the engine again would end his employment immediately. No questions, no appeal. Mason simply pulled the tarp back over the housing with careful hands, the same way a person covers something they have decided to protect rather than abandon, and said nothing further as the group climbed back up into the cold light of the main floor. Evelyn lingered behind for a moment, looking back at the shape under the tarp, and felt for the first time since taking the chair that she had finally found something in this building worth fighting for without compromise. The story of what had happened 12 years earlier came out in fragments, pieced together through the halting memory of Logan Price, the retired chief engineer who had once led the Meridian project from the ground up. The engine had been the most ambitious work of Harlan Motors' founder, Evelyn's own father, a design meant to cut fuel consumption, raise output, and finally free the company from its dependence on a handful of exclusive supply contracts. When the project neared completion, a testing accident tore through the program almost overnight. The board declared the engine an outright failure, shut the project down within days, dismissed the entire technical team, and pressured many of them into signing agreements that forbade them from ever discussing it again. Logan was forced into early retirement before he had any real chance to defend the work he had spent years building. A young technician on the testing team had noticed something wrong with the safety valve configuration just before the final test run, and had filed a report flagging the irregularity to his supervisors. That report vanished without explanation, and so did the technician's name from every record connected to the project afterward. That young technician was Mason Carter, barely in his 20s at the time, the most junior member of the testing crew, with no real power and no one above him willing to listen. After the accident, blame quietly drifted toward Mason simply because he had been the last person to service the equipment before the failure occurred. He lost his position, lost any chance at another senior technical role anywhere in the industry, and found every door that should have opened for a man with his skill closing instead. He chose eventually to take work on a factory night shift, a job that asked nothing of his reputation and offered a steady, dependable income. It let him stay quiet, stay out of sight, and rebuild a life that no longer depended on anyone believing him. The matter of his daughter was mentioned only briefly, almost in passing, the way painful things often are. Mason had once considered fighting the company through legal action, but he abandoned the idea because he needed a job, any job, to provide for Grace, and a long legal battle would have left them both with nothing in the meantime. Evelyn listened to Logan's account in stunned silence, struck by the thought that her father might have spent his final years believing the project of his life had genuinely failed him. Logan corrected her gently. Her father, he said, had never once believed the engine itself was the problem. Near the end of that conversation, Evelyn returned to her father's old desk and found a handwritten note tucked inside a folder she had overlooked for years, a single line that read, simply, "If Meridian dies, find Mason." She read it 3 times before she fully understood what her father had been trying to tell her all along. The handwriting was shaky in places, the ink faded near the edges, as though the note had been written and rewritten more than once before he finally let it sit untouched in that folder. Evelyn pressed her palm flat against the paper for a long moment, feeling something close to grief and something close to direction arriving in her chest at the very same time, and she understood with sudden clarity that finding Mason again was no longer optional. Jackson sensed that Evelyn's suspicion had grown into something more dangerous than curiosity, so he called an emergency board session before she could organize her thoughts into action. He opened the meeting by declaring Mason a safety liability, a man with no management credentials and no legitimate reason to be anywhere near company property of that value. Cameron produced an old personnel file that had clearly been edited, describing Mason as a careless maintenance worker responsible, at least in part, for the failed test 12 years earlier. Several board members made no effort to hide their contempt, referring to him dismissively as a single father who fixed machines for hire, someone who did not belong in a room like this one. Evelyn tried to defend him, but Jackson reminded her, calmly and pointedly, that a vote against the board's wishes could cost her the very chair she was sitting in. Mason absorbed every insult without flinching, his face unreadable, his composure never once breaking under the weight of being spoken about as though he were not in the room at all. The sharpest moment came when Jackson tossed Mason's employee badge onto the table and demanded he sign a resignation letter on the spot, in front of everyone. Mason looked down at the badge for a long moment before he spoke. He said that if they truly believed the engine downstairs was worthless, they would not be so afraid of a mechanic touching it. The room went silent in a way that felt almost physical. Evelyn seized the opening immediately, proposing an independent inspection in front of the full board and the buyer's representatives, a public test that could not be quietly dismissed afterward. Jackson could not refuse the proposal without revealing exactly how much he feared what that inspection might uncover. Cameron, attempting to regain control of the room, set a brutal condition. Mason would have only 48 hours to prove the engine could start without incident. If he failed, Evelyn would lose her position as chief executive, and Mason himself would face legal action for damaging company property in the attempt. Mason agreed without hesitation, asking only that the original technical files from the project be unsealed and made available to him. Later that evening, alone in his office with the door closed, Jackson made a quiet phone call to someone outside the company, his voice low and tight with urgency. He gave a single instruction before hanging up, telling the person on the other end, in no uncertain terms, not to let that machine come back to life. He sat alone afterward in the dim glow of his desk lamp, turning a pen slowly between his fingers, replaying the look on Mason's face when he had refused to flinch in front of the entire board. For the first time in 12 years, Jackson allowed himself to consider, briefly and uncomfortably, that the man he had once dismissed as nothing more than a maintenance worker might actually be the single greatest threat he had ever faced. Mason returned to the basement with Evelyn, Joseph, Amelia, and Logan beside him, the 5 of them stepping into a space that felt closer to surgery than repair work. Dust clung to every surface, wires hung brittle with age, and torn fragments of old documentation lay scattered across a workbench nobody had touched in over a decade. Mason moved through the engine methodically, checking each valve cluster, each fuel line, each pressure sensor with the unhurried patience of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. He worked slowly and precisely, almost as though he were listening to an injured body describe exactly where it hurt. Evelyn watched him and realized this was not simply familiarity with machinery in general. Mason seemed to remember individual scratches on the metal, small marks that meant nothing to anyone else in the room. Logan confirmed that several components had clearly been swapped out sometime after the night of the original accident, parts that did not match the engine's documented specifications. Amelia, digging through an old backup archive, found a system access signature belonging to Cameron, logged in the system mere minutes before the accident occurred 12 years earlier. Cameron had never been an engineer, yet his financial oversight role on the original project had granted him approval authority over component changes, a detail buried deep in old procurement records. Mason located the proof himself. The pressure limiter had been swapped for a cheaper substitute that did not meet the engine's required specifications. a part chosen for cost rather than safety. That single discovery confirmed what Mason had suspected for 12 long years, that the explosion had never come from a flaw in the Meridian design itself, but from a deliberate act of sabotage disguised as a budget decision. He remembered, almost against his will, the night of the original accident, when he had been pulled away from the testing floor only minutes before the engine failed. He had suspected something was wrong even then, but he had never possessed any proof strong enough to challenge the people above him. When Evelyn asked why he had never come back to fight for the truth sooner, Mason answered simply that not everyone has the resources to take on an entire board of directors, especially when they also have a family depending on them to keep working. The answer left Evelyn quiet for a long moment, unable to find a response that did not feel inadequate. Just as Mason began disassembling the main control housing, the basement lights cut out without warning, and the heavy steel door sealed itself shut behind them with a sound like a verdict being delivered. For a long second, nobody moved at all, the darkness pressing in close and total, broken only by the faint green glow of an old emergency panel blinking somewhere near the far wall. Mason's hand found his flashlight without him even needing to look for it. And in that small, automatic motion, Evelyn caught a glimpse of exactly how many times in his life this man had already learned to stay calm when everything around him went dark. The basement plunged into total darkness, trapping the entire group inside with no obvious way out. The ventilation system stopped working almost immediately, and the temperature began to climb as a backup generator kicked in incorrectly, feeding heat into the space instead of air. Joseph suspected almost at once that this was no accidental failure. Mason pulled out a flashlight and began working through the old electrical panel with steady, unhurried hands, refusing to let the rising heat rush his judgment. Evelyn noticed, for the first time with real clarity, the difference between Mason and the powerful men who usually filled the boardroom upstairs. He did not raise his voice. He did not look for someone else to blame. He simply kept working methodically, as though panic were a luxury he had never been able to afford. Mason eventually found a breaker that had been deliberately jammed to create a controlled short circuit, a small, precise act of interference rather than a random mechanical fault. Someone wanted them frightened, wanted them to abandon the basement, or wanted the evidence inside it quietly ruined before anyone could examine it properly. On a nearby security monitor, Cameron appeared in the control room, performing concern for the cameras while subtly preventing another maintenance crew from opening the sealed door. Amelia recorded every strange instruction Cameron issued on her phone, careful to capture both his words and the timestamp attached to them. Logan began to suffer chest tightness from the heat and the thinning air, his breathing growing shallow and labored in a way that worried everyone watching him. Mason immediately moved him toward the section of the room where airflow remained strongest, then turned back to the exposed electrical panel, despite the obvious danger involved in working it. Drawing on decades of familiarity with the plant's old wiring, he managed to reroute a secondary circuit just as Evelyn began to feel lightheaded from the lack of oxygen herself. The door finally released, and the group stumbled out into the corridor gasping for clean air. Jackson appeared moments later, feigning outrage over what he called a serious safety violation, as though the danger had simply materialized on its own. Mason spoke up in front of everyone gathered, saying plainly that the real violation belonged to whoever had locked living people inside a room with a sabotaged engine. Murmurs spread quickly through the gathered workers, suspicion finally turning, for the first time, toward the people upstairs. Before the night ended, Evelyn formally suspended Cameron's technical access across the entire facility, a decision Jackson immediately and loudly opposed. Joseph stood close to Evelyn through the confrontation, his arms folded, his face set in the kind of quiet anger that came from seeing, in plain terms, what the people above him had been willing to risk to protect their own interests. Mason said little else that night. He simply gathered his tools, checked once more on Logan's breathing, and walked home through streets still dusted with snow, carrying inside him the strange, unfamiliar weight of finally being believed. Amelia kept tracing the old data trail and eventually located a backup server that had long since been removed from the company's primary network, sitting forgotten in a records closet nobody had cleared out. Logan remembered that Evelyn's father had always kept an independent copy of every major design file inside the old drafting archive, separate from the systems the rest of the company relied on. Mason, Evelyn, and Amelia made their way there together, working through drawers of brittle folders until they found one roll of technical film that had somehow survived intact. Inside it was the final design of the Meridian engine, complete with handwritten notes in the founder's own script along the margins. One note confirmed, in plain language, that Mason had filed a report warning about an unauthorized component change before the original accident ever occurred. That single line proved beyond any doubt that Mason had never caused the failure that ended his career, but had tried, quietly and unsuccessfully, to stop it from happening in the first place. Amelia found something else buried in the same archive, an old internal exchange between Jackson and Cameron from the weeks before the accident. The contents revealed that the board had deliberately buried the project, not out of safety concerns, but because a successful Meridian engine would have shifted financial control away from them and toward the founders' planned restructuring of the company. They had never intended for anyone to be hurt, the message suggested, but they had accepted the risk anyway in order to quietly destroy the test and bury the program for good. The accident that followed became the perfect excuse to shut the project down, sell off the secondary patents, and keep their grip on power intact. Evelyn read the exchange twice, then sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the realization that her father had been betrayed by people he had trusted with his life's work. Mason did not offer hollow comfort. He told her, simply, that the truth could not bring back what had already been lost, but it could still stop the same people from writing the next chapter of this company's history. Evelyn straightened, her grief hardening quickly into resolve. She decided then that she would not only save the factory from being sold, she would make sure the board's conduct became impossible to hide from anyone. Word of the discovered files reached Jackson before the night was over, and he responded by moving the vote on the factory sale forward, scheduling it for the following morning before anyone could slow him down again. Cameron argued that moving so quickly was reckless, but Jackson cut him off, insisting that the only way to survive what was coming was to finish the sale before the board could even consider reversing course. Across the city, Evelyn sat in her father's old study long after midnight, the technical film spread across his desk, preparing the argument she would need to deliver in the morning with absolute precision. The next morning, the main boardroom filled with directors, attorneys, buyer representatives, and a handful of senior managers, every chair occupied well before the scheduled start. Jackson opened with a cold, rehearsed statement, declaring that Harlan Motors had reached the end of its useful life and that selling the factory was the only responsible path forward. Cameron followed with a slide deck full of carefully edited loss figures, presented as undeniable proof that the plant no longer held any meaningful value. Evelyn objected immediately, demanding the vote be delayed until the Meridian inspection had been completed as promised. Jackson mocked her openly in front of the entire room, suggesting she was gambling the company's future on the instincts of a mechanic with no formal title to his name. Mason was called into the boardroom shortly afterward, treated by several directors as little more than a witness brought in for novelty rather than substance. One board member asked him directly whether he had any evidence beyond what he called a mechanic's gut feeling. Mason set a charred, blackened component on the table in front of them, along with the original design drawing pulled from the archive the night before. He explained the discrepancy in plain, simple language, careful and unhurried, until even the directors with no technical background could understand exactly what had gone wrong 12 years earlier. Cameron tried repeatedly to interrupt and redirect the conversation, but Amelia calmly produced the access logs that placed him at the scene of the tampering before the original accident. Jackson kept his composure, insisting that everything presented so far remained speculation unless the engine could actually be made to run successfully in front of witnesses. Evelyn answered by announcing that the inspection would happen immediately, in full view of the board, the buyer's representatives, the assembled workers, and the facility's own internal security cameras. Jackson found himself cornered, unable to refuse without making his fear of the outcome obvious to everyone watching him. If the engine failed to start, Evelyn would lose everything she had fought to protect, including her position at the head of the company. If it succeeded, the board would lose far more than a sale, facing the very real possibility of a criminal investigation into what had happened 12 years earlier. The room fell into a tense, uneasy quiet as the stakes settled fully into place. Mason rose from his seat without another word and walked out of the boardroom toward the basement, the entire factory watching him through the windows as he passed. Workers stopped what they were doing on the floor below, drawn quietly toward the corridor, as word spread that the engine everyone had heard whispered about for years was finally being brought up into the light. Evelyn followed a few steps behind him, matching his pace, and for a brief moment neither of them said anything at all. the silence between them carrying more weight than any speech either could have delivered in that boardroom. The Meridian engine was hauled up from the basement into the main testing bay for the first time in 12 long years, its surface still streaked with the dust of everything it had survived. Workers gathered behind the safety line in numbers far greater than anyone had expected, while the board watched from the glass observation room above, and Evelyn stood close to the control panel with her hand resting near the activation switch. Jackson and Cameron tried to appear calm, but the tension in their shoulders gave them away to anyone paying attention. Mason pulled on his protective gear and made one final pass over every connection, checking each fitting with the same unhurried patience he had shown from the very beginning. He spoke little, asking only that Joseph call out the pressure readings, that Logan confirm each measurement against the original design, and that Evelyn herself retain control over the final activation. A young engineer nearby, clearly nervous, asked Mason how he could possibly be certain the engine would not explode in front of everyone watching. Mason answered that machines do not lie, only the people who describe them do. The first activation attempt failed almost immediately, the engine shuddering weakly before falling silent again. Jackson seized the moment, declaring loudly that the test had already proven enough to settle the matter once and for all. Mason did not panic. He listened carefully to the final sound the rotor had made as it spun down, and he realized that a secondary fuel line remained sealed shut, a line Cameron had quietly ordered locked sometime earlier without anyone noticing. Mason requested that the line be opened immediately. Jackson shouted that doing so could kill everyone standing in the room. Mason turned and looked directly at him, asking calmly how Jackson could possibly know that particular valve was dangerous unless he had once studied the original design himself. The room went utterly silent. Evelyn gave the order to open the secondary line without further hesitation. Mason adjusted the regulator with his own hands, made one final correction, and stepped back from the engine to wait. The second activation began with a dry, hesitant clatter, almost disappointing in its uncertainty, before deepening into a low, steady rhythm that sounded less like machinery and more like something waking from a very long sleep. The pressure gauges climbed and then held perfectly steady. The temperature readings stayed safely within range. The auxiliary electrical systems flickered on, one after another, casting new light across faces that had not expected to see this moment at all. The Meridian engine ran. It did not explode, it did not falter, it did not fail. The entire room stood frozen for a long breath before the silence broke into something closer to disbelief than celebration. Evelyn, tears rise without warning, though she held her posture exactly the way a chief executive should. Logan pressed a hand to his chest, looking at the machine the way a man looks at an old friend he had given up for dead. Mason simply stood still, his eyes heavy rather than triumphant, because for him this was not a victory to celebrate but 12 years of his life finally being handed back to him. On the display behind him, the performance readout climbed steadily upward, confirming that the engine had exceeded even its original design specifications by a wide margin. Almost as soon as the engine settled into a steady run, Amelia made the access records, the old internal messages, and the evidence of the swapped components fully public to everyone in the room. The buyer's representatives withdrew from the deal within minutes, realizing the assets in front of them were worth far more than anything the board had ever reported on paper. Workers gathered outside the testing bay began calling loudly for a formal investigation into what had truly happened 12 years earlier. Jackson tried to slip out of the observation room, but Joseph and the internal security team blocked his path on Evelyn's direct order before he could reach the corridor. Cameron, visibly unraveling, attempted to shift every ounce of blame onto Jackson alone, insisting he had only ever followed instructions from above. Jackson fired back just as quickly, claiming Cameron was the one who had actually swapped the components himself, and within seconds the two men were openly accusing each other in front of cameras, attorneys, and a room full of stunned witnesses. Amelia reminded everyone present that the entire test had been recorded, including an unguarded remark Jackson had made earlier about the danger of that particular secondary valve. Evelyn used the moment to formally remove Jackson from his operational authority, invoking an emergency clause meant to protect company assets from exactly this kind of conduct. Several board members who had stayed quiet throughout the crisis quickly began distancing themselves from Jackson entirely, eager to protect their own positions now that the truth had surfaced so publicly. Mason was asked to say a few words to the workers gathered outside, and he kept it brief, without any trace of bitterness in his voice. He told them the factory had not died because its machines grew old, but because the people at the top had simply stopped believing in the people working below them. The words landed hard among the crowd, several of whom had spent years feeling exactly the same way without ever hearing it said aloud. Evelyn announced, plainly and without hesitation, that Harlan Motors would not be sold. The Meridian engine would undergo a full independent certification, and the original technical team, scattered for over a decade, would be invited back to help rebuild what had been taken from them. Logan's reputation was formally restored before the entire room. Mason's old personnel file was corrected the very same day, the false blame erased from the record at last. By the time security finally walked Jackson out of the building, he passed directly beside the very engine he had spent 12 years trying to keep buried in the dark. He did not look at it. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw tight, his hands cuffed loosely in front of him, while the workers lining the corridor watched him go without a single word of sympathy offered in his direction. Cameron was escorted out through a separate door minutes later, still muttering about contracts and clauses that no longer mattered to anyone listening. Late that night, once the chaos had finally settled into something quieter, Evelyn found Mason alone in the workshop, the factory around them silent except for the faint hum of light reflecting off the Meridian engine. She apologized to him directly, telling him that her family's company had taken 12 years of his dignity away from him without ever once looking back to consider the cost. Mason told her she had not been the one who caused any of it, but that she now carried the responsibility of deciding what happened next. Evelyn offered him the position of Director of Engineering for the Meridian rebuild, a role with real authority and a title that finally matched the work he had always quietly done. Mason hesitated, admitting he was not comfortable standing in front of cameras, was not used to wearing a suit, and had never wanted to become anyone's symbol of anything. Evelyn told him plainly that she did not need a symbol. She needed the one person who had actually listened to this machine when no one else would. Mason eventually agreed, but only on the condition that the original crew be kept on permanently, and that anyone wrongly dismissed over the years be given a genuine chance to return if they wanted one. Evelyn accepted without a moment of hesitation. In a small, quiet detail that passed almost unnoticed, Mason glanced at his phone and saw a short message from Grace asking whether he would be home late again that night. He typed back a brief reply, telling her the factory had its lights on again tonight. The message said more about what he had accomplished than any speech could have, a small private signal that he had not only saved a company, but had also secured something steadier for his own family's future. Logan arrived a short while later, holding out an old technical badge that had been kept in storage for 12 years, never thrown away despite everything that had happened. The name printed on it still read Mason Carter, untouched by time or by the lies that had tried to erase it. Mason held the badge for a long moment, something tightening in his chest, though he did not let himself cry in front of anyone. Before he left the workshop that night, he pinned the badge onto the chest of his new protective jacket, where it belonged all along. He stood there a moment longer, looking at the engine one final time before switching off the overhead lights, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt no urgency to look over his shoulder on the way out. Evelyn watched him go from the doorway, struck by how quietly he carried something that would have made most men insufferable with pride, and she found herself thinking that her father had chosen the right person to trust, even if it had taken 12 years for the company to catch up to that truth. Several months later, Harlan Motors had moved firmly into a season of recovery, no longer a company waiting to be sold off but a working center for cleaner, heavy-duty engine technology built on the foundation Mason had helped restore. The Meridian engine passed its full independent certification with results that confirmed its enormous commercial potential, exactly as the founder had always believed it would. Evelyn kept her seat at the head of the company, though she ran it differently now, more transparent, more willing to listen to the people on the factory floor, and far less willing to hand unchecked power back to any single board again. Amelia led both the civil and criminal proceedings against Jackson, Cameron, and the others who had taken part in burying the truth 12 years earlier. Logan returned in an honorary advisory role, finally given the recognition that had been stripped from him for so long. Joseph was promoted to oversee operational safety across the entire plant, a responsibility he had effectively carried for years without the title to match it. Mason never turned into the kind of loud, self-congratulating figure that stories like this often produce. He still arrived early most mornings. He still checked the machines himself before trusting anyone else's word for it. He still spoke only when he had something worth saying. But now people addressed him by his actual title, and more importantly, they spoke to him with a respect that had taken 12 years and one impossible engine to finally earn. A quiet trust grew steadily between Evelyn and Mason over those months, the kind that could, in time, become something warmer, though neither of them felt any need to rush toward it. At the official unveiling of the Meridian program, Evelyn asked Mason to start the engine himself in front of the assembled workers, the press, and a new generation of young engineers eager to learn from him. Mason looked toward the section where the original crew stood together, then glanced briefly at Logan beside him. He kept his remarks short the way he always did. He said only that an engine could be hidden away for 12 years, but the truth never truly stops waiting for the day it gets switched back on. He pressed the activation switch himself. The Meridian engine roared to life once more, no longer the sound of a buried secret but the unmistakable sound of justice finally arriving where it belonged. Evelyn watched him, fully understanding now that the man the entire board had once dismissed without a second thought had saved far more than a single machine. He had saved the soul of the company her father had built. The story closed on Mason walking out of the plant at dusk, the light behind him burning bright and warm, a quiet symbol of dignity returned and a future finally allowed to begin again. Behind him, through the tall factory windows, the Meridian engine continued its steady, even rhythm, a sound that would carry on long after everyone in that room had gone home for the night. Somewhere out past the parking lot in the gathering blue of early evening, Mason's truck waited exactly where he had left it, ready to carry him home to the one part of his life that had never once needed saving, because it had never once stopped believing in him. If you want to know exactly who buried this engine for so long, stay with us until the final explosion.